Okay, so I'd say I suppose what I've been doing work on for the last 20 years is really trying to understand suicidal risk. And one of the big challenges we've had more recently, is you'll see in a second with some slides looking at how suicide rates are sadly increasing. But one of the big things we're often trying to understand is lots of people sadly have thoughts of suicide, but thank God most people who think about suicide don't make the transition from thinking to attempting suicide. So the two things I'm going to try and, in my whatever 10 slides, is help us understand why people become suicidal in the first place, and then give you some Scottish data that we've got looking at the factors which we think make it more likely to make that transition from thinking to attempting suicide. So in that context, I mean, that suicide is obviously an absolute tragedy, and that across the world we reckon there's about 800,000 people each year who die by suicide globally, and in Scotland there's between 700 and 800 people on average. Now some years a bit lower, some years it's a bit higher, and it depends how the statistics are calculated. But Scotland, over the last 10 or so years, we've made really good progress in terms of reducing the suicide rate. But that changed last year. So as you can see this from the headlines here in this slide, when the 2018 data which were published, there's always a year delay in terms of the reporting of those statistics, but when they were published, we see this stark increase. So it was about average about 15% increase in suicides in Scotland last year. And now, although we have to be really careful that we don't over extrapolate from 1 year's data, that means the size of the increase of 15% would suggest that is a real increase. And also what was really marked was that the suicides in young people are on the increase. In some levels, that's not surprising, because we know from other data in terms of presentations to hospitals and mental health services is that young people's mental health, even before COVID, seemed to be going in the wrong direction, getting worse. Then in the context of today, one of obviously the most stark statistic of all suicides is that people who die by suicide tend to be male in Western countries, well, in all countries in the world. But now in for example, the UK or Scotland, it's 3 times. So about 75% of suicides tend to be men. And that means that's just such a stark male-female ratio. Now, when we look, conversely, people who attempt suicide and who don't die, that tends to be more female to male. It used to be a bigger gap, but it's not as big now. But the key statistic is, yeah, more men die by suicide and more women attempt suicide. And if you look at this, it's just some of the statistics just really highlighting that point I just made about the male-female difference. As you can see, this graph really clearly illustrates that difference. And you can see, if you just look, doesn't matter which line you look at, but you can see after this sort of peak in the early 2000s, over the last 10 or 20 years, there's been this steady, some blips obviously, but on average, the suicide rate decreased by about 10% or about 20% over the last 10 years. That's with the exception of obviously last year's increase. So we really need to look at this in more detail now. And if we just bring the COVID context into play, although it's not inevitable that the pandemic will lead to an increase in suicide, our concern is that it may do, because that if you look at SARS in 2003, there was an increase in suicide following SARS, but only in older adults. Now, the other thing we know, and again, it's really relevant now, is that at the last recession in 2008, the suicide rates increased. And you usually find the world over that at times of economic crisis, or obviously huge economic strife and difficulty, people losing jobs and unemployment and so on, the suicide rates increase. So that's one of our main reasons why we're really concerned about, obviously, the pandemic, and that although we've had furlough, there still have been lots of job losses already, and we're now probably in the midst of easily probably the biggest recession of our lifetimes. So we really need to be really cautious and protective. And the people who will be most affected will be working age individuals. And if you look at suicides, given that 3/4 of all suicides tend to be men, and obviously including fathers will be potentially particularly affected. So if you look then in terms of who tends to die by suicide in terms of ages, we've already highlighted that it's 3/4 men, but you can see this of the sort of curve which illustrates that in general all suicides, doesn't matter male or female, tend to be really rare before puberty. But then when puberty kicks in, as you can see here, going through from your 15 right through then up to peaking at midlife. So now the most common age group for men to die by suicide is middle age. So you can see here between the ages of 35 and 54. So when people in the prime of their lives are sadly ending their lives, they just can't see a way to move forward and live for the future. And I suppose really, when you think about fathers, that I mean, obviously people can be fathers at any age, but we'd argue be going through your 20s, and we start to have that transition then into family life and fatherhood. So it'd be really interesting to look at that, because actually there's been surprisingly little research looking at fathers, or if fathers who don't get to see their kids, or fathers going through divorce. All these we know are all risk factors, but we still don't know enough about actually in terms of the hard-nosed research. But a few years ago with Samaritans, we published this report looking at suicide effectively in midlife. And one of the challenges we have with midlife suicide is, and one of the reasons why I think it's pretty dangerous for men in terms of midlife, is that when relationships tend to break up, they tend to break up statistically in midlife, and men are much less likely to have a support network, an emotional support network beyond their partner. And so that's one of the reasons we think there is this contributory factor to increasing risk of suicide in that age group amongst men. Now, suicide is caused by a multitude of factors. You'll see in a second when I present a model of suicide, but there's a whole range of factors at play. So then the other thing just then on this slide is then as you get older, then now older adults tend to be relatively protected from suicide. And again, that's a change in the statistics over the last 20 or 30 years. So when I first started working in this field, the biggest one of those columns would have been young men. And then, and what seems to have gone on over the last 20 years is young men, when I was starting this work in the 1990s, as in my 20s. So I've carried my risk of suicide with me, my generation. And that's why you seem to see this peak now in midlife. And my concern with regard to this change in terms of the mental health of young people getting worse and the suicides increasing in young adults, is my concern is now, this will be potentially exacerbated by COVID, is we might now start to see this increased peak in young men again. Okay, so I said earlier there's lots of factors associated with suicide, and please don't worry about this figure. It's a pretty complicated figure, but it's really just to highlight the whole range of different factors that are associated with suicide. So at the very top, you've got social context. And again, some of these issues I've touched on already, but we know that suicide affects some communities more than other communities. So communities where there's a lack of social cohesion or togetherness, there tends to be higher rates of suicide. We know in certain geographical locations, suicide rates are different. So in Scotland, we know that there are high rates of suicide in the heart of disadvantaged areas in our cities, but there are also high rates of suicide in our isolated communities in the Highlands and Islands. There's a whole load of stuff to do with social isolation, because anybody who's socially isolated has a statistical increased risk of suicide. And then we move on to the sort of distal factors here in this sort of second layer. So we've got early life adversity, and there's now just such accumulating evidence that early life trauma, doesn't matter what that trauma is, could be abuse, it could be divorce as a child, it could be other any sort of really negative event which happens a child before the age of 16. Again, there's evidence that that's associated with increased vulnerability to mental health problems and increased vulnerability to suicide. And then we've got things like family history and genetics. We know that risk of suicide does run, not quite run in families, but we know that given mental illness is associated with suicide. Some mental illnesses, obviously, there's a relatively strong genetic component, so there's that family relationship. And then the other concern, though, is even if you know somebody who has attempted suicide or died by suicide, although the risk is small, statistically you're at increased risk yourself of attempting suicide. Now, it's really important to highlight that's overwhelming majority of people will be absolutely fine, but it is a statistical risk factor. And then in the middle here, I'm not going to go in much detail on these, but the developmental factors, I'm going to return to some of the personality and sort of other factors which help us understand suicide. And I'll return to that later. I want to just quickly jump to the sort of proximal factors. And again, we've got things like, you can see here, life events. We've got a whole range of sort of mental health problems like depression, hopelessness, and I'll return to entrapment. And we know that people who attempt suicide have experienced a disproportionate number of negative life events compared to people who've never been suicidal. And then alcohol and drugs are also implicated in the mix. So there's we know that so obviously alcohol is a depressant. So unsurprisingly then that overuse of alcohol, often maybe as a coping strategy, will then impact on perhaps your ability to sleep, which impacts on your ability to problem solve, which maybe also can impact on relationships and so on, all contributory factors to understanding suicidal risk. Okay, so that's just to give you very quickly to give an idea about the complexity of the factors associated with suicide. It doesn't matter if you're a mother, a father, a son or a daughter, a whole range of these factors will be playing a part increasing your risk. But what I want to focus in on now is a model of suicide that I've developed, which hopefully will help make sense of why some people become suicidal and other people don't. And what happens that some people who are suicidal never make that transition from thinking about suicide to attempting suicide or dying by suicide. So again, this may look complicated, but it's relatively straightforward, hopefully anyway. And again, as we're saying, any of the material I'm talking about today is all available on our website, suicideresearch.info. So it's all available on suicideresearch.info, and there's podcasts and other supporting material if people want to know more about this sort of work. But really what I want to focus in on is the key components of the model. So first of all, the model for shorthand is the IMV model, or the Integrated Motivational Volitional Model. And basically what it argues is that if we just focus on this central portion here, which I call the motivational phase, and it's called the motivational phase because it's trying to understand the motivations or what factors lead somebody becoming suicidal in the first place. And in a very straightforward way, the argument is people become suicidal if they feel defeated and humiliated or experience rejection and loss from which they feel trapped, that they can't escape from. So the argument is that suicidal thoughts emerge when people feel trapped by this unbearable pain or trapped by life circumstances. And a lot of the factors that were on the previous slide will contribute to the likelihood that you may become or feel defeated and humiliated and or become trapped. But in the very straightforward way, so the argument is feelings of defeat and humiliation from which you cannot escape increases the likelihood you'll become suicidal, okay? And there's a range of other psychological factors which underpin that, which I'm not going to say much about today, but I'm happy to answer questions on it. So, and we've done lots of research now which has shown that if we do interviews with people who attempted suicide, really medically serious suicide attempts, or we've investigate suicide notes or talk to family members of sadly loved ones who've lost the struggle to live. You just see loads and loads of evidence of entrapment, of predicting the suicidal risk. Now, the other bit about the model I want to highlight is, so first point is that entrapment is a key driver to you becoming suicidal. But if this second question, which I think is sort of a really important one, is we will all either have experienced suicidal thoughts ourselves or know somebody who's experienced suicidal thoughts. And for many of those people, those thoughts are transient and the person never acts on those thoughts. But what this model tries to do is understand what are the factors that make it more likely that if somebody is suicidal, so in the motivational phase is suicidal ideation and intent. So if they've thoughts of suicide, what are the factors that make it more likely that they cross that precipice, they make that transition from thinking about suicide to attempting suicide, or sadly dying by suicide. And basically, I'm going to return to that with some data in a minute. But basically, the argument is, according to this model, is that if you have thoughts of suicide, and if you've got lots of what I call volitional factors, and I'll explain what volitional factors are in a second. If you've got these volitional factors, you're much more likely to act on your thoughts of suicide. And so the next slide, I'm just going to basically highlight what those key volitional factors are. Okay. So if we can move to the next slide, yeah. So what I've done on this slide is basically just blown up the very right-hand bit of the model. And all I want you to just think about now is on the left-hand bit of the model, we've got people who have thoughts of suicide and basically in suicidal intent. And on the right-hand side, we've got people then, if you then look at the arrow, who have attempted suicide. And the bits in the middle are factors which make it more likely that you go from having thoughts of suicide, and then you go from left to right, the thoughts of suicide to attempting suicide. And many of these are relatively straightforward, but I'll just go through them. So unsurprisingly, if you think seriously about suicide, and you talk about high levels of suicidal ideation, and if you take the first one, if you've got access to the means of suicide, so you've got ready access to a way of taking your own life, unsurprisingly then, you're more likely to make this transition from thinking about suicide to attempting suicide. And then the second one is planning. So we know that the greater extent an individual has planned their suicide attempt, they're much more likely to act on their thoughts. So the extent to which somebody has formulated a plan. So indeed, if somebody is expressing suicidal thoughts, the first thing we should try and do is ask them whether they have a plan, and if they have, to keep them safe. Because the suicidal thoughts with a plan make it much more likely that a person will actually act on their thoughts of suicide. And then the third one is exposure to suicide or suicidal behavior. So what that is simply is, do you know a close family member or a close friend who has attempted suicide or died by suicide? I mentioned this in the introduction, but again, it's a really important risk factor, is that if you are thinking about suicide yourself and you have had a family member or a friend who's attempted suicide or died by suicide, you're much more likely to act on your thoughts of suicide. Now, again, remember, these are statistical relationships. Most people will never, ever act on their thoughts. Then we've got fourth is impulsivity. So again, if you're thinking about suicide and you tend to be an impulsive person, you're much more likely to act on your thoughts of suicide. So in a way, that's not perhaps that surprising. But the difficulty is, if you're impulsive, it makes prevention and intervention more tricky, more challenging. And then the next two are probably two which are less familiar, because what these are basically are characterized, or these come together, they're described as what's known as the capability for suicide. Do you actually have the capacity to carry out a suicidal act? And so a researcher in the United States, Thomas Joyner, says that the capability of suicide has two components. And the first component is actually having the physical pain tolerance which is required to actually withstand that if you actually carry out a suicidal act. And so we believe that you have to have this higher physical pain tolerance to basically go through with the act. And then the second component of capability or capacity for suicide is you have to be overcome effectively the life instinct. So you have to become less fearful about dying. So you get higher levels of fearlessness about death. And the argument is high levels of, oh, what's happened there? High levels of physical pain tolerance, high levels of fearlessness, both make it more likely you go from thoughts to attempting suicide. And then there's just two more to go in terms of these volitional factors. So it's this, what's the second last one is this mental imagery. So we know that, and the same in any other sphere, if you imagine or visualize yourself doing something, carrying out an act, you're more likely to engage in it. And it's exactly the same with suicidal behavior. You're more likely to basically make that transition from thinking to attempting suicide. And then the last one is past behavior. So the single best predictor of whether you'll make the transition from thinking about suicide to attempting suicide is if you've done it before. So best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Okay, so I'm just going to, that's really all I was hoping they sort of convey just more generally at this stage. So the key message thus far is suicide, obviously the factors are obviously multiple and varied, and there's never just a single factor that leads to suicide. Second thing is that although there's a whole set of complex factors, some from your past and your present, and what you think about the future, that all contribute to an individual becoming suicidal, the key driver to someone becoming suicidal is this sense of entrapment. You're trapped and you cannot see an alternative. And suicide is seen as the way to end the pain. And suicide is so rarely is it about the person wanting to die, it's about wanting the pain to end. And then the last bit I try to convey is the factors that lead you to attempt suicide are different from the factors that made you suicidal in the first place. And that these volitional factors are the key factors that make the transition more likely from thoughts to attempts. So on that note, I'm going to stop sharing screen and then just open it up to, I'm going to leave that bit. How did I just get this? Stop sharing. Yeah, so hopefully I didn't cut out. I couldn't tell if it was cutting out or not, but I think one head kept nodding away, so I think I got through. Okay, so that's just a sort of intro-y. So I'm happy to take any comments or questions. Is there something on the chat? Let's see the chat's go on the chat. Right, okay, so right, Susie Hayward, do you want to just speak out or say your question, because it's a long question?
Yeah, I guess I have a little bit of a concern about the fact that we are potentially facing an increased risk. I know we don't know for sure, but the signs are there. And also the fact that at the moment there's a pause on a lot of our usual suicide prevention activity within communities. And my personal experience of being involved in that is that there's a lot of people in the field who are really cautious about moving some of that onto online and things like this, and a real kind of fear or a sense of increased risk that seems to me anyway to be getting in the way of us actually doing anything. I wondered if you had any thoughts about online suicide prevention or awareness training, and whether it's useful or whether it's risky, and whether you feel that people are right to be cautious around some of this stuff.
Yeah, no, I think they're great questions. I think that so we just attended with a meeting of the National Suicide Prevention Leadership Group last week, and so although there has been a pause in some activity, so we've work is proceeding. So what we've tried to prioritize the work sort of based on what we think will be most effective at this stage, and prioritizing some at-risk groups and so on. So there is work ongoing. But I suppose the challenge we had in the Suicide Prevention Action Plan was some of the people who are leading the work were being redirected or redeployed back to the NHS, and so it was a capacity, in part a capacity issue. Now, I think Scottish Government in particular are well aware that this is a risk, and I think they have thus far tried to, they've done quite a bit so far in terms of prioritising mental health, but it's a long road, and I think we're in it for the long haul. Now, I am genuinely concerned about an increase in suicide, because on the back of already, I think that even if COVID hadn't happened, I think we may have still seen an increase this year, but we don't know yet. The statistics haven't been published. And I think there is, I know the ministers is well aware of that, of those concerns. So I'm hopeful that things are starting to, some of that pause work will hopefully restart. So yes, in terms of your question about online, so again, we don't know for certain the effectiveness of training which was delivered face-to-face, is it effective online? We just don't know yet. But I think we have to try. And there's work, so we're involved in trying to get some work up and running to try and test out the utility, not necessarily of training, but maybe some working with people who are suicidal to try and help them. And we're trying to get some funding for that at the minute. But the reality is that things have changed, and that we have to try and find new ways of supporting people. But I think that we need to continue to put the pressure on the funders and the government and service providers. That the reality is, we know we've been doing a monitoring study of people's mental health across the UK and in Scotland, another study in Scotland, and there's clear evidence that mental health has been affected. Now, we don't know yet the longer term impact of that, but we've some data which is suggesting that perhaps suicidal thoughts may be on the increase. We're just submitting that for publication at the minute. And in particular, young people, the group who are most affected. The mental health of young people compared to every other age group is worse. People from more socially disadvantaged backgrounds, it's worse. People with pre-existing mental health problems, it's worse. So we know, we've got enough data now to know who are particularly vulnerable. So hopefully that's answered your question, Susie.
Thank you, thanks.
So Douglas, well, Andy Man's Club, does somebody want to talk about that?
I can talk about several things, Rory.
Yeah.
I'm always interested when I see an O'Connor, which part of Ireland you're from. Sorry to be nosy.
I'm from Derry, the very north.
Yeah, we won't hold that against you, Slash City. I've got some good friends from Slash City.
Yes, indeed.
Andy's Men's Clubs is something that's risen in the last wee while, and I know friends that go to that and get a huge amount of support, and it's grown exponentially. I'm also the founder of Fathers Network. David Drysdale, a good colleague of mine, was the centre manager of the Mankind Project, which runs men's initiations and men's groups. So I've witnessed them, because I'm part of that sometimes the only place I've found that men can share deeply and also work on trauma is in informal men's groups. Sam H last year brought people together around that issue, but I've not seen things go forward. But during the COVID-19, I can daily check in with other men and find out how they are, because I'm part of that group. And it's one of these things that people are wanting to reach out to more men, because it is a space that you can start to address your wounds, your healing. So be interested to know, because I think the digital world has exploded in the last 3 months. Working for Homestart, and I see a few friendly faces here, there was a deep resistance to this, and older people, old men even, were resistant to this as a platform. But I've got a feeling that this is here for the future, and my kids are not resistant to this platform. So
yeah. No, I think though, I think Andy Men's, whether there's other ones across the country, and I think they're brilliant. But I suppose it's trying to see how do you optimize them in a new way. I think that. So my other concern is the digital divide is going to get worse. So the 15% of people who aren't digitally connected, and I think it's trying to think of how your organizations can, and all organizations can, ensure that we either equip those people who are, she just made the point about older people to start, and obviously many of them now coming on board or getting connected. But I think we need to do whatever we can to make sure that people do get the access. But I think that without a doubt, I think having a place, I mean, there's so much evidence from men's sheds through to let's see, Mind to Men, obviously, Susie's mentioned again in Glasgow, and other initiatives like yours. I think they're just so invaluable. Absolutely. But I know, I remember Billy Watson from Sam H, he told me about the meeting you had, and I think, so, and he was really excited about what's been going on, and exactly the growth, that there is that incredible growth there, but it's making sure it's sustainable. So, yeah, no, great. Anything else? Chris, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I'll try and make it a bit more succinct. Yeah, basically, we know that dads are also affected by depression, and during that natal and postnatal period, up to 15%, and that more men suffer from anxiety and stresses that they don't feel that they're managing during that period. We've been doing a lot of work over the last couple of years with health services and others across Scotland, looking at raising awareness of that amongst health professionals and others, third sector staff and so on. But there's been a couple of tests done down in England using the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression score or scale, which is what mums, the tool that health professionals use to engage mums in conversation about their mental health. And it's just a tool, it's the conversation and a tool that I think really counts. But given the context of male suicide in general that you've described, and given that we know that male mental health is more vulnerable during the antenatal period, and actually those tests showed that the men that took part in those tests displayed higher instances of suicidal thoughts during that period as well. Is it not time that we looked at some kind of screening tool, a universal screening tool, or at least process for all men during that period for all the right reasons? And we've actually began some discussions with NHS Fife, and it's something that we're going to start to look at. But I was really interested to hear what you thought about that.
Well, so in principle, I think I agree. It's a group of the pop, or a large sample of people who are missed, I think, currently. This challenge with any screening tool is that they're usually not good enough to, you either miss the people who you shouldn't miss, or obviously you think somebody's at risk and they're not. And so that's the difficulty with screening when the context of suicide risk. So if you were trying to think, this can be screens a young dad, so we can see, is this young dad, or not, doesn't have a young dad, any dad at risk of maybe becoming suicidal. We're just not there yet in our ability to do that. But that's not to say that we shouldn't routinely try and check in and monitor the mental health of new dads, without a doubt. I mean, that just makes perfect sense. But you said you've explored this already, and have you had much?
I mean, I suppose I completely I agree and can relate with the point you make there about the tool not always being the best way, and even for mums, the postnatal depression feel itself is far from perfect. As I say, it's more about having the conversation. It's more about giving parents the opportunity to consider their mental health and think about it. And nothing may come of that. But at the moment, we did a survey last year, and I think something like 1 in 10 men that got back said that they'd been asked to think about or to consider mental health. So obviously 90% of guys aren't even been asked the question.
Yeah.
So I suppose that's where we want to take it, and the way to get that done universally would be through a sort of an agreed, well, I don't want to use the word process, but just to standardise the practice in whatever way, shape or form that might take. So we're going to be doing some work with that with NHS Fife. We're in the very, very initial discussions with that, and we're going to be developing that with a second health board as well. So it's a huge undertaking, but we're at the very early days of that right now. Yeah,
no, I think that's really laudable work, and fingers crossed. Some obviously it develops. So I'm trying to say any other questions, because a lot of these are comments. Stuart, you had a question, I see. Just put one up.
Yep, so it was just, by the way, first, thanks for that. That was really interesting. Just a quick question about the information on the slide. So it seems, I guess on the surface anyway, it seems quite obvious that this current situation and what's likely to come will increase, I guess, motivation for people, certainly in that motivational phase, things like entrapment, etc. But I just wonder if there's any obvious way that it will increase those volitional factors, you know. Yeah, effectively that's the question.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the way I think it's likely to increase the volitional factors is the exposure variable in particular. So you know the people you know who've attempted suicide or died by suicide. Because the stark reality is, if the suicide rate increases or people are attempting suicide more, you're going to come into contact, or statistically, people are going to come into contact with more people. So certainly that. I think the other issue would be if you are caught in a trapped situation, right? So it doesn't matter what the entrapment is. It could be domestic violence. It could be relationship crises. It could be financial crises. So my concern is then you're in this situation that your mental imagery, you're much more likely then to be, you're so preoccupied with that sort of rehearsal is less likely to be disrupted, and I have a concern about that. But overall, the one which basically isn't there as a sort of volitional factor is just people experiencing more. We know that I didn't talk about the pre-motivational phase on the left-hand side, but the bottom line is people experiencing many more traumatic or stressful events that just ups the ante. So we know, like, the financial situation is, I mean, we've done some analysis from our data from across the UK, and it's really clear, even people who are experiencing financial hardship or thought they were struggling to get on before COVID, I mean, their mental health, just compare their mental, we've just done some analysis, and their mental health is just, irrespective of what's happened to them at COVID, right, in terms of financially, their mental health is really affected. So I think that we just, the economic fallout, we're only starting to see the start of. You know the point I'm making there, if I could say it more clearly. Okay, other questions or comments? We've got another 15 minutes, I think. Regular questions. Do you think, Graham, do you think we just expect young people to grow up, whatever the crisis? I think that's a great point. And I mean, I think how the UK, I think how we've dealt with young people through this crisis, I think is awful. And I genuinely think, I mean, I've 2 kids. My daughter is a teenager, and she's really struggled. And I just think how we've managed the lack of school thing, it's just been horrendous, I think. And we're from a fortunate family.
I think my point was that, you know, if you look at my generation, Generation X, you know, we are the ones dying by suicide. You saw that on your graph.
Yeah.
And we've got this Generation Z just now, who are the campaigning generation, the activist generation, saving the planet, but they're living in really uncertain times. And you know, I sometimes think with boys, especially, the stereotypes kick in, and we just expect boys to suck this stuff up. And it's, you know, for me, it's relationships. You know, it was the lack of support that probably some people had in my generation going through it, that lack of resilience, that ability to interpret situations. I think the same is the case for young people just now. We just expect young people to grow up in this current crisis. And I think we all need to start thinking about how we invest in relationships with everybody within our circle of friends, our networks. That for me is the protective factor. It goes back to relationships.
Yeah. I suppose I'm just wondering whether, because I think these things go in cycles, and so the generation now, right? So the young people now are my generation, whatever, your generation 20 years ago, and I remember. So I often there's a conversation with my daughter as well. She thinks she's a campaigning generation, right, because of climate change and everything else, right? As if we have done nothing, right? So it's like, so my daughter's generation is trying to claim all credit for whatever gay rights, and I said, what? This, come on, right? So I don't know if I agree. I think there's just a very different circumstances, and I think for me, I think connection is correct, and my concern is that the uncertainty when they look to the future, I think might be different, which we didn't have. I think you're definitely onto something there, but I don't think we know. I think it's a really interesting question, but because I think in some ways, I think they are so much better connected than we ever were. but their future is different. So when we were 20 years ago, the expectation might have been that you would, if you're looking to get a job, you get a job for life, and that was all straightforward. Whereas now that all uncertainty is up in the air. They've just gone through a recession, or their parents have gone through a recession in 2018, and the scars of that recession are still being felt. So I think it's a really complicated one, but that's a really good point, though. Any other what's this one? Gender expectations. Susie, again, do you think we explain?
Yeah, just generally I'm interested in how things like gender stereotypes and masculinity and things play into some of the statistics about men being more likely to complete. And I wondered if you see that as being where one of the factors in that maybe women are attempting suicide at where their distress is at an earlier kind of stage, whereas men are not seeking help and leaving things until it's really gotten to be really serious. And I guess also just generally about where you see that kind of gender stuff fitting into your model.
Yeah, so I just know, John, we'll give it, John, I see you've got your hand up, John Forsyth, so we'll come back to that in a second. I think the gender one is really complicated. So there's no one reason why or explanation for why men are 3 times more likely to die by suicide than women, except it's in part to do with the means of suicide that they engage in, because they're much more likely to die. The second is definitely the masculinity is tied up in help seeking. The help seeking one is not as straightforward as men don't seek help, because obviously we know that men do seek help, but they do seek help statistically less than women. But often the difficulty is when they do seek help, the help's not tailored to what they need or want, and there's a big issue there about that. And then, but there's definitely qualitative data, which the other point, Susie, about men do though wait before they seek help. So perhaps things have escalated more, and then to solve or intervene or support is more difficult. But I'm sick of just hearing it's about help seeking, because it's just much more complicated and nuanced than that. But yeah, but I think but the other thing is, without doubt though, it's the method selection is the most important one, and that's the one. But sadly, we can't intervene because the people are sadly dead then. John Forsyth, you had your hand up, raised hand.
Yeah. Thanks very much. It's been very interesting. In case you don't know, we're shared parenting Scotland, so most of the people that come in who seek help from us are, the majority are men, but not all by any means. And what the concern is that we have is that a lot of them do come to us feeling very troubled, because in terms of your graphic, they feel humiliated, they feel trapped, but also, and perhaps it connects up with Susie's question a minute ago, they feel invisibilized, because when separated fathers seek help, they often find that they're criticized, or the public narrative is against them, so they feel discouraged from seeking help. And I know it might sound like a terribly trivial thing, but an extraordinary number of guys picked up on the fact that during the COVID emergency, on Mother's Day, Nicola Sturgeon put out a big message saying, thinking of all the mothers on Mother's Day, great stuff. But on Father's Day, nothing. It was just brushwood. And so they feel, that's the sort of thing that would, if you were to put that to a government minister or a politician, they would think, God, that's trivial. But actually, it reinforces the fact that they feel actively discouraged from seeking help on many occasions.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I totally sympathise. I mean, I didn't know that. I didn't hear Nicholas do the Mother's Day one, but I certainly didn't hear the Father's Day one. But no, I don't think that's trivial at all. I think these signals, are important. I think there's enough barriers in the parent and how parenting is negotiated in the following the breakdown of relationships. There's enough barriers as it is, and I think we do whatever we can to facilitate and support everybody. And yeah, and so I think co-parenting is tricky. So I agree with you 100%, John. But I think we just have to. It is a risk group. Anybody following any breakdown of any relationship, that's a vulnerable period for all of us. And for men, I think, well, in terms of the suicide statistics, men who die by suicide tend to be not in a relationship, and that it could be single, divorced, separated, whatever it is. Whereas interestingly, and women who die by suicide, albeit it's 25%, tend to be in a relationship. So make of that what you may. But the reality is it's that isolation, and then dealing with all the other complexities of parenting. I think you're a great point.
But I think if I could just add in, I put on my note on the chat thing that there is also an extremely potent sense of bereavement.
Yeah.
Like it's almost like the para-bereavement, as in para-suicide.
And absolutely, when we were talking, when we were doing some work on COVID, and we talked about bereavement in the traditional sense, we've extended that now to talk about, and this agrees with your point, is so there's a bereavement in terms of loss of identity. And then in the context of you don't have access to your children, that bereavement, all that is, I mean, they're as powerful as a bereavement of somebody dying. I mean, that's and needs to be responded to, I mean, really appropriately. So no, I'm 100% with you. Others, what was this? I've heard 1 in 10 men can't self-identify as being lonely. Can't or can? Can't. Oh, because it's denial. Douglas has come in with that. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm surprised it's only 1 in 10, to be honest. So other ones here coming out. Right. Is there any other points in the last 5 minutes left?
Yeah. There's a question from Emma.
Emma. Oh yeah, Emma. So Emma, do you want to ask your question?
Hi. Yeah. I suppose I'm just very aware that for a lot of our services at the moment, we are seeing an increase in, so our service supports parents through the perinatal period with their mental health, and we are seeing an increase in the effect of mental health on the whole family, yeah. And the incidence of suicidal thinking is on the rise, and our staff are very much involved in listening to very complex and distressing phone calls and providing much more intensive support. So I guess I'm just thinking about the kind of the vicarious trauma that arises from that, and whether, given that one of the volitional factors is around exposure to suicide, you know, what are we going to be looking at, what the effect is of the current COVID-19 period on people who are involved in that very intensive support, which has maybe been around but has grown, or for some people this is a very new thing, which is part of working alongside people where the rationale for your service becomes more prescriptive around your existing boundaries, and it's much more holistic because mental health is affecting all of us so much at the moment.
Yeah, well, the short answer is I couldn't agree more. I think that the vicarious trauma, I think we're not clear yet how it'll play out, but it's just bound to, and I suppose then it's how that's managed at a local and a national level, and a service level. I know, for example, we've been involved in the distress brief intervention program in Scotland, and obviously it's been rolled out now nationally. And part of, people are, even though the DBI is not seeing people acutely frontline, you're still, the stories we're hearing back are just, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So then people who are working intensely with people who are going through acute trauma, that's just absolutely. But it's something I know in terms of the mental health, there's government put together a mental health research group I'm part of, and these are sort of issues we're talking about. What can we do? What do we need to do to know how best to intervene and support? And Andrew Gumley, who's chairing that, he's really conscious of people at the front line and what can we do. So it's definitely there, but it's just getting it in place and supporting this as much as we can. Anything else? I think Susie checking the message like that. That was good. Thanks.
Rory, I'm just wanting to add, I don't know if you can hear me or not.
Yeah.
Lisa Jane from NHS 24, work for the Breathing Space Service.
Yep.
My understanding is that there's going to be a health and social care helpline for staff that will look at self-care, access to DBI and also psychological help. I don't have a great detail around that, but certainly it's maybe for people to just for me to mention, and maybe there'll be more information coming out in the future, and maybe that'll tap into some of what Emma was saying and getting that support in amongst everything that they're dealing with. And also that there's breathing space, you know, when people are distressed, they can, although they're, it might not, it's about their work and the trauma, they can still use breathing space as a space to take and be listened to, you know.
Absolutely. No, thanks for that, Lisa. Okay, anything else burning in the last 2 minutes? Just because I just have another call at 3, otherwise I would have stayed on. But I mean, I think I sort of just sort of my point of view. I think that the COVID stuff, I think we're only starting to see obviously what's really going to the sort of longer term impacts of it. Most people I think will be fine, but I think those groups we really mentioned, obviously young people in particular, and socially disadvantaged and people with pre-existing mental health problems, I think really are going to struggle. And the point we made about understanding whether this move to digital, what's the impact of not doing face-to-face, and for many people, I think that needs to be investigated more. But I think, I'm pleased to live in Scotland, and a country which certainly seems to prioritise and value mental health. So, and I think that although things aren't going perfectly, I think there has been a genuine effort thus far to try and be proactive. But obviously, we just need to keep the pressure up so that this continues, and that especially if we now start to see an increase in suicide or continuing, I think we really need to be really, really careful and cautious.
Okay.
Right.
I'm aware you have to shoot off to another call now, Rory. So unless anyone's got anything they want to chip in while I'm finishing off here, thanks so much for coming along and doing this talk, Rory. I think it's been a really invaluable talk, a really important conversation to have, not just right now, but in general anyway. And I think Susie made a comment there just saying we need to keep talking about this kind of thing. So
absolutely. And just to say though, if there is, if you are looking for any more information, just go onto our website at suicideresearch.info.
Great. And
there's more material there. But no, thanks, Chris, and thank you, everybody. I didn't quite think there'd be as many people here, to be honest.
So on with this busy, Rory.
Okay, thank you guys. Take care and have a lovely afternoon. Bye bye now.
Thank you.